Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're back in War Thunder and we're looking at aircraft modifications and what you should look for, what you should go for, and everything like that. Now, this is not like tanks or ground forces, the stuff that we covered before. There are large differences between what you will get for bombers and what you will get for fighters. It's not just, medium, light, and heavy tanks, which generally you go down the same path. They're very streamlined. But with fighters, bombers, attackers, and everything like that, there are many different ways of looking at it. So instead of just looking at them all, we're going to focus primarily on the fighters, and then maybe talk slightly about the bombers, and that's about it. Attackers, in my opinion, do not have a huge place in the game. Most fighters can cover the attacker role pretty well and still be combat affected after their ordnance is left. So we're going to use the Germans as an example, looking at the Focke-Wulf 190 D9 first. So, let's have a look. This is basically the standard stuff that you will see when it comes to modifications on most aircraft. There will be some differences, such as on the Bf 109 G6, where we can see that you have some modifications that you can add. Gun pods, rockets, bombs, everything like that. So that's generally where the differences are when it comes to most aircraft. Now, instead of looking at bombs and rockets, which generally should be the last modifications you go for if you're playing fighters, just because you want to be as combat effective as possible, and also with the new realistic battles mechanic, where you can actually kill armored cars after a certain point, about 20 minutes into a map. Generally, bombs are not very useful unless you're playing mixed battles with ground forces and air forces. Then bombs can be useful, but it's going to take you a very long time to get bombs which are actually useful. If we look at the Focke-Wulf 190 D9 as an example, you have to get 1, 2, and then 3 modifications in bombs before you get a bomb which is actually going to put a dent in something at 5.3. Which is a 250 kilo, and then once you get these era bombs at the 500 kilo and the 500 and 450s, you're going to put a bigger dent. But it's going to take you a long time to get that, and obviously it's going to be kind of useful. Useless for you if you're in arcade battles or realistic battles for aircraft. So it's much better to focus on the performance upgrades for fighters. So what are we looking for in the first tier? Fuselage repair is generally something which to go for first, but in my opinion, what you should go for is the radiator. The reason for this is because it increases your max speed just slightly more than the fuselage repair, which means that it increases your climb rate. So if we look at just climb rate and max speed from this, then the radiator is slightly better than the fuselage. So it's going to give you a slightly better, more stats compared to the fuselage, so it's overall better. It's slightly better in arcade as well because of the cooling time for the arcade afterburner. Generally at tier 1, if we look at other nations as well, let's just get a plane up. What will happen is that you also have some kind of offensive belt. Now, on certain aircraft, it makes sense to prioritize something like this because your default belt will be kind of useless. So on a Focke-Wulf 190 D9, getting the offensive 13mm belts is generally not very useful, because you already have a decent belt of IT, APT, and IAI, and also you're going to be doing the majority of your damage with your 220mm. Whereas if we go over to, let's say, a Spitfire, it's tier 1, yes. So a Spitfire, default rounds are pretty bad. The Spitfire Mark 1A. So it has TAP, API, Ball, I. So it has 2 rounds there, 3 rounds if you want to include the AP, which are completely useless. But if you unlock offensive 7mm, then you get these 3 rounds here, and the traces, as you can see, IT and the API, it basically gets rid of the useless rounds that you have in default. So for certain aircraft, it is definitely worth getting that first offensive upgrade. Now this just comes down to the aircraft. It is a decision you're going to have to make. I'm not going to go through all the aircraft and tell you which ones to take and which ones to research first. So on a Focke-Wulf D9, using it as an example, the first two upgrades you're going to get are the fuselage repair and the radiator. This will give you your 2 tier 1 upgrades, so your tier 2 will be unlocked, and then you have a few more options. You have the new 13mm MGs, the airframe, and the compressor. Now there's this little arrow here between the offensive 13mm and the new 13mm MGs. This means that if you do not have offensive 13mm unlocked, you cannot unlock this. So if I uninstall this, but I can't install this, so it doesn't matter. It basically means you have to have this upgrade before you get the 13mm MGs. So it's always better to focus on the airframe and compressor in this case. Give yourself a bit more engine power, make yourself a bit more streamlined, put yourself into the position to take the enemy. My philosophy, a lot of the time when it comes to dogfights in War Thunder, is if you can get yourself into a position which is advantageous over the enemy, it doesn't matter what belts you have, as long as you can keep that position and also generally hit your first shot, you will kill the enemy, especially at this level at 5.3, especially with 20mm. So, that is why I prioritize performance upgrades instead of just belts and guns. The new 13mm MGs is kind of useful. I mean, it gives you slight less weapon spread of -4 meters, but this isn't like ground forces where adjustment of fire makes a huge difference. This upgrade really doesn't make that much of a big difference because you're firing a hell of a lot more shots, and also sometimes that spread can help. If you're struggling with accuracy or you're getting used to a new gun, it can help. It also helps in head-to-heads. The Bearcats, the F8F1B with its 420mm, against jets, a lot of jets will try and head on you, and that spread can help because sometimes it will mean that you get shots which you wouldn't have got if you have the accuracy buff because the jet turned off when you didn't want to. So, airframe and compressor, once again, two things to focus on. The one I would go for first is the compressor, just because it gives you that climb rate. And overall, it's just a little bit better, but it depends on, once again, the aircraft you are using. If you are using a turn fighter, so let's say, one of the early Spitfires, the Ki-43s, early Ki-61, stuff like that, where it's much more about getting that turn on the enemy instead of being above the enemy and setting up a decent dive and trying to beat them in an energy fight. You want to go for the airframe first, because the airframe gives you, it decreases your turn time more, but it doesn't give you as good of a climb rate boost. So for that, you'd want to go for the compressor. So if I was flying the Focke-Wulf 190D9, in my opinion, a really good energy fighter, which does need to get up. It needs to get to a high altitude to be very combat effective and be at the point which it enjoys fighting from. I would go for the compressor first, because it gives me that climb rate, where the airframe only gives me slightly better turn time. So compressor is what you will be aiming for. And then after getting those two modifications, we move on to tier 3. So we have, once again, wings repair and engine, and offensive 20mm. So the offensive 20mm will be unlocked because, as you can see, there's no arrow here, so you don't have to get the 13mm MGs to unlock the offensive 20mm. This will just be able to be researched when tier 3 is ready. So, is it worth offensive 20mm belts? Is it worth researching them straight away? Once again, you have to make a call. You have to make a call to see if you think it's worth it or not. The default rounds on the 20mm on this Focke-Wulf 190D9, the MG151s, is pretty good. IT, APHE, HEI. They're all going to do damage. They're going to cause a lot of fires. A lot of people like the mining shots belts, the high explosive incendiary shells. So a lot of people like taking the air targets belts. So once again, it's just an opinion thing. In my opinion, it is maybe worth going for over wings repair. Just because wings repair doesn't really give you that much of, it doesn't really give you a lot. Basically, it gives you 0.3 meters per second climb rate and minus 0.4 seconds turn time. That's comparable to, half of an airframe and half of a compressor. It's not going to give you that much of a boost. Whereas if you're struggling or you feel like your guns aren't doing a lot of damage, and by this point, you should have at least a few games in this thing, then, getting the ammo would be very useful. Now, in contrast, if we go over to the Russians, let's get a thing which isn't a 37. Let's take the Yak-9. Looking at the 20mm, the default belts are amazing. FIT, API, all of the belts on the Russian planes are amazing. So you don't have to, on the 20mm I should say, of the Russians, which is the Shvak. So prioritizing the offensive belts on something like a Yak-9 is not very useful, because whatever round you use, it's going to be very good. Now, this may be slightly different in ground forces if you're looking to ground pound or whatever, therefore armor penetration does make a difference, but if we're just going from just realistic battles, fighter on fighter, aircraft on aircraft, then it's just a decision you're going to have to make. Generally, it is a good idea to get it, in my experience, but there are definitely a certain aircraft that you can make the argument where it's not needed, such as the majority of Russian aircraft. If we move over to the American aircraft, then a lot of American aircraft... Let's get a P-47 up here. There we go. A lot of American aircraft benefit greatly from something like the offensive 12.7mm belts, but that's just because your default, it struggles a little bit. You have APIT, API, but then once you get the tracer belts, you get APIT, and as we all know, the American lasers of death do a hell of a lot of damage. So once again, it comes up to the plane, it comes up to personal opinion. If you believe that your belts are not doing enough, then it's something to prioritize. In my opinion, looking at the D9, we would go for the engine upgrades and then the wings repair, just to give us that boost. Now, between these, the engine upgrade is the one to go for. It gives you, once again, plus 1 meters per second climb rate, which is quite good compared to everything else we've seen. Wings repair only gives me 0.3, and because I'm in a D9, I'm prioritizing climb rate. I'm prioritizing trying to get that energy advantage. So we have these to unlock now. So, moving on to the last Tier 4 upgrades. What do we go for? Engine injection is always the upgrade you should go for first in a fighter when it comes to Tier 4. Cover is useful. It gives you plus 0.6 climb rate, 0.3 seconds turn time, but engine injection, as you can see, plus 1.6 and minus 0.4 seconds. Engine injection in every case, or at least the majority of cases, I can't think of one where it's different, but the engine injection is always better than the cover. So the engine injection should be prioritized. It's generally the best upgrade that you can get for a fighter. It's kind of like the crown. Once you unlock everything else, you get the crown on top, and you make your fighter a lot better. You will see a massive difference between a plane which has engine injection and has not. It makes that much of a difference. So after you've taken engine injection, you would take cover, and then it's kind of up to you if you want to get the belt or if you want to get the bombs. If you mainly play realistic battles with just aircraft on aircraft, obviously you're going to prioritize the belts and the guns just to make yourself a bit more precise and maybe do a slight bit more damage. But when it comes to ground forces, maybe you prioritize the bombs. It's kind of as simple as that. Now moving on to the BF-109G6, the same ideas apply. The same ideas apply all the way through, but we do have some interesting differences. We have some modifications. The modifications are generally changing the guns on the aircraft. You'll see them present on some of the Ki-43s. I'm not sure if they're on the Ki-44s, but there are a bunch of BF-109s which have them, basically changing the 30s and the 20s, the gun pods on the wings, and then the the D5 Ju-87 also gets the opportunity to get that modification as well, which is here, the gun pod, and whatever that is. So let's just have a look at how crazy that looks. Also on the F-82E, I believe it is. That's not the modification. There we go. Yeah, you can get these, which are basically 6.7.92s in each of the wings, or you can get 220mm on either side. So that's an example of modifications. This comes down to playstyle. A lot of the time, I see a lot of people not run the add-on modifications, and I don't know. For me personally, I like them. I like getting into the position where I am a bit higher in the air. Obviously, having modifications means that you're going to be a bit heavier. Your climb rate's going to suffer a little bit. It's basically the same as carrying a bomb, but once you get up to that altitude, if you're able to stay above the enemy, then the modification is going to give you that extra firepower which may win you the battle. So it's really a playstyle issue. If you want to be a complete purist when it comes to altitude advantage, energy fighting, you will not take these modifications. Maybe if you want a bit more burst power, maybe you're worrying about your accuracy, then you take the modifications. Some planes also have a modification which changes some of the guns which are already in. So the center gun on this BF-109G6, which is here, is a 20mm. But what you can do is unlock a modification, which is here. If you install it right there, it will change the gun that's in your nose, if it actually changed that. That's maybe something they need to sort out. But basically, it changes the gun which is in the nose. So it's not just, you know, adding on modifications to the wings. You can also get modifications for the guns which are inside your aircraft. This is just a preference thing. I personally prefer 20mm. The reason for that is because I get more ammunition, and also I think they're a bit more accurate. I really don't like the 30mm that the Germans have, so therefore for me 20mm, if I can, is a way to go. But do these modifications, where do these modifications come in when we talk about against performance upgrades? Now, in my personal opinion, taking the performance upgrades first is what you should go for. There aren't many planes which handle well without performance modifications and having gun modifications. So let's say I have, I don't have this, I don't have this, and I don't have this, and I don't have this, and I'm here. And just having these, I decide to barrel down here and get the R6, the R5 modification, or the R6 modification. So you've got two heavy guns plus ammunition on your wings, but you don't have a lot of performance upgrades. That thing's going to handle like a barge. It's not going to be able to climb, and it's going to struggle. So if you prioritize these performance upgrades here, then what's going to happen is that once you have a good handle on the aircraft, because obviously during this time you're going to be flying it, you're going to be getting used to it, then you have the opportunity to put more guns on it. Maybe it's a bit heavier, but you have that extra engine power to back you up, which you wouldn't have if you decided to stop getting the flight performance upgrades right here. So yeah, basically overall, prioritize flight performance upgrades and then the survivability ones, as you can see here. It really depends on what gun you're using when it comes to if you need the belts or not, and also personal opinion. really. I mean, it doesn't it doesn't come down to much more than this. If you want me to go through all of the aircraft, or at least all of the guns in the game, and work out, tell you which belts are the best or which belts I use, then, let me know and I'll do a whole video on that, and I'm sure it will be very long and arduous, but it will be done. So where does this change when it comes to bombers? So let's just go over here and set up my Halifax crew. There we go. Let's get the big boy in here. Love the Halifax. Really nice model in the game. So, when it comes to a bomber, you have a few different upgrades. When we look at B-17s or late-stage bombers, generally you'll get flak jackets, which will help your gunners, it will help your pilots stay alive a bit more, which can be useful, depending on if you're struggling from stuff like that. Let's just see if I can show you. Is it on the E? Yeah, so you get protective vests, and as it says, allows partial protection of the crew from fragmentation effects of flak and aerial shells. So there you go. I still would prioritize the flight performance and the radiator. Sorry about that. But let's get back to the Welly, which is a Halifax, and have a look at its modifications. So the two main differences between bombers and fighters, looking at modifications and stuff like that. Obviously, bombers, you want to prioritize getting the bomb loads. Some of the bomb loads aren't worth getting, though. As you can see here, the reason I picked the Halifax is because it's a straight add-on. Every time that you get a bomber upgrade, what you actually get is an increase in bomber power. So we're going from 15 250s to 15 500s. Fair enough, I think SUBC Mark 1 is a very good upgrade to get. MBC Mark 3, let's see, 15 500s, so we go to 9,000s and 6 500s. So that's £9,000 at 3,000, so we're looking at £12,000. And then we look at this, it's £7,500. So you can see that getting this is very important. Where does it rank compared to performance upgrades? It really depends on what you're trying to bomb. If you're trying to hit ground targets such as vehicles, you want heavy bombs, but you want a lot of them. So you would prioritize taking the MBC Mark III. If you are very good at working out how many bombs you have to drop to kill a base, then sometimes it's actually worth getting the performance upgrades. Looking at another, is it the Wellington? I think the Wellington works well here. If we look at another aircraft, yes, it is the Wellington. So the Wellington is a case where what happens is a lot of the bombing upgrades are kind of useless, if you think about it. So, first of all, we get the TC Mark 1. Now, the TC Mark 1 means that you can install 2 torpedoes. If you know anything about torpedoes, the British ones are very, very bad. And very hard to use. Maximum speed in water is 74 kilometers an hour. Drop speed is 0 to 281 kilometers an hour. That's actually increased compared to what it was before. But the next upgrade is to get the Cookie, the 4,000 pounder, which can be useful, but generally isn't useful until you're in ground forces. And then the next one is allow installation of additional 250-pound bombs. So you go from 10 250s to 18 250s. So that's a direct upgrade. That's a good one. And then we move, allows installation of 500-pound bombs. This isn't good, because we're going from 18 250s to 9 500s. So if you struggle with using a macro of dropping all your bombs at once, or if you don't want to hit the space bar or whatever thing you've got it mapped to, then getting this upgrade is good. If you are fine with, doing those things, such as setting up a macro, which is now, officially in game now, or just hitting the spacebar a bit more times, then the 9500s upgrade, which is the last one, is completely useless to you. So that is something you've got to take into account. Look at the amount of power that you're bringing to the table. There's no point in upgrading from 18 to 250s to 9500s. Literally no point. So instead of getting this upgrade here, it would be better to focus on other things. So you've just got to have a look at what you're going to be dropping, and also compare it to how much a base needs to be destroyed, or how much a vehicle needs, how close you need to be to that vehicle, all of that stuff. There's a lot of stuff to take into account when we're looking at if you want to get bomber modifications or not. But the general rule is, if it's going to give you a bit more power, it's worth focusing on. If it's not, and it's just going from different size of bomb but overall same payload, then there's not really much point at all, really, when it comes to it. Unless, you know, you're once again playing mixed battles. But we're looking at it from a realistic point of view. So that's basically all I've got to say on modifications when it comes to planes. Focus on performance, unless you're flying bombers, when sometimes it's worth looking at the bomb loads. But anyway, I'll catch you next time.